Glasgow might not be the stadium capital of the world overall, but on a per capita basis it's definitely up there. Here are the stadiums and arenas of Glasgow, Scotland. We start off at Firhill Stadium, which has been the home of Partick Thistle ever since it opened way back in 1909. As is often the case with these old and small European football stadiums, every side of the ground is different from the next. At Firhill there's an old school stand covered by a gabled roof on the western side. That was built at around the same time that the stadium started hosting greyhound racing. There's a much more modern stand on the opposite side, which is effectively the main stand, but it isn't called that. To the south is an empty end occupied by advertising signage. That's called the passive income stand. And at the northern end sits a small modern stand overshadowed by an apartment building. I believe it's actually student accommodation. From street level you can't even tell there's a stadium back there. I believe the club have been planning on doing a similar thing at the southern end for a while. Which makes perfect sense. Or pence, I should say. Emirates Arena. You may have noticed that this is a bit of a conjoined twin situation. It is in fact an arena and a velodrome combined. However, it's just the arena that meets the capacity cutoff for this video. But don't worry, you're not missing out on any traction, because there's another type of track in here, that being a 200 meter running track. Thankfully, due to the power of hydraulics, the track can disappear to allow the venue to host tennis or basketball or badminton as it did at the 2014 Commonwealth Games, without an unsightly track keeping the spectators back. Another feature that I always appreciate is the vast amount of windows that let in the daylight I should say. I forgot where we were for a second. Celtic Park is the largest football stadium in the country, not the UK, Scotland. That's despite the fact that there's another stadium in this city that's known as Scotland's National Stadium. We'll get to that one soon. Although Celtic Park is very old on paper, 3 of the 4 stands here were only built in the late 90s. Before that it was an almost oval-shaped stadium, one that was looking a little tired. You can clearly see that it's this smaller stand here which is ironically known as the main stand. That is the one which predates the redevelopment. It was built in 1929, a fact that is perfectly reflected by its stunning red brick facade. Despite the vast difference in age between the main stand and the rest of the stadium, I think it all blends together nicely, inside and out. Just a lovely stadium, no wonder they call it paradise. I do kind of feel for what must be a very small group of people who both hate Celtic and have a relative buried in the neighbouring cemetery. The north stand partially overhangs some of the graves. Actually, what am I talking about? That's doing them a favour on a rainy day. If you liked the brick-clad main stand at Celtic Park, but not the modern additions, and you also hate Celtic, then perhaps Ibrox Stadium is for you. Each of the 4 stands have a facade featuring red brick. Not all are equally beautiful though. This one is kinda ugly. But this one, the Bill Struth main stand, is spectacular. Although little did you know that on the other side of the camera there is a dog that's... just completely disrespecting this fine stadium. Typical Labradoodle? The main stand is probably the highlight of the interior as well. I love the look of an equally proportioned triple-tiered stand, and I love those enclosed stairwells in the corners. On the opposite side, the corners are filled with some sizable video boards. Oh, and I should say that this ground is home to Rangers, who are Celtic's arch rivals. Most of you were probably already aware of that though, as it's one of the most famous football rivalries in the world. It's known as the Old Firm, which might not sound as intense as the Derby of Eternal Enemies that they have in Greece, but that name is slight overkill to be honest. Slight. Ovo Hydro. Fittingly, the hydro is situated right by the water, specifically the River Clyde. It's also located right next to the Sydney Opera House's Scottish cousin called Armadillo. Speaking of water, the arena got very wet before it even opened. No, it didn't flood. but the roof actually caught fire during construction. Then came the hoses. You might be a little surprised to hear that this is one of the busiest arenas in the world, especially considering that it doesn't even have a sporting tenant. It's a venue that's used mainly for concerts and shows, and was designed for those purposes. The seating layout is quite distinctive. It's sort of a multi-tiered amphitheatre that nearly forms a full circle. To be clear, whilst it doesn't have a sporting tenant, it has hosted a considerable amount of sport in the past. Netball and gymnastics at those Commonwealth Games, for instance. You'd think that in a city of Glasgow's size that 2 large football stadiums would be more than adequate. But they also have Hampden Park, which is not the largest stadium in the country nowadays, as I referred to earlier. However, the capacity was a lot more impressive at its height, which was around the mid-20th century AD, when it could accommodate approximately 150,000 officially. At that time, it was the largest stadium in the world. I should note that the population of the city centre was considerably larger back in those days. I should also say that Queen's Park Football Club, the ground's main tenant, are not the reason for those huge crowds. Hampden Park is also the home of the Scottish national football team, and it also hosts big cup matches. Like most stadiums, the design has changed a lot over the years. It's transitioned from mostly terracing to an all-seater. I quite like the current day asymmetrical ball design. Basically all the seats are undercover and it looks pretty good. The one downside is that unlike Ibrox and Celtic Park, it hasn't been fully converted into a proper rectangular stadium. Scottstoun Stadium. It gets the name Scottstoun Stadium because it's in an area of Glasgow called Scottstoun, which in turn gets its name because... I assume it's because there's a large Scottish population in Scottstoun. Come to think of it, there are lots of Scottish people in Glasgow generally speaking. Don't know what that's about. Anyway, this stadium is home to an athletics club, evidently, but it's also home to the Glasgow Warriors, who are the biggest rugby club in Toon. Edinburgh is really the home of rugby in Scotland. Glasgow, as we've seen, is all about football. So despite being the biggest rugby club in Toon, they have to play at a stadium that is not purpose-built for the sport. They do add some temporary stands at the ends to improve the situation, and it is still a solid stadium regardless. St Mirren Park. A reminder that I like to include the entire metropolitan area, and although Paisley is its own distinct city, I believe it is still considered to be a part of Greater Glasgow. Greater Glasgow. I like the sound of that. I like the sound of that. Shall we do the rest of the video like this? I can't do it. This ground and its origin story is like many others across the UK. The club sold their old stadium to a supermarket, and with that Tesco money they built themselves a Tesco Value Stadium. Not all that far away. I'm not trying to disparage it by calling it a Tesco Value Stadium. I'm just saying that it's a little bit generic. It has few bells and whistles, but it certainly does the job, and it only costs £8 million to build. Compare that with a name brand stadium and you're looking at savings of upwards of 30%. Just make sure you have your Tesco club card with you at checkout. And those were the Glaswegian stadiums. Should I follow it up with Edinburgh? I probably will. Thanks for watching, have a good one.